Welcome back to Night Mind, friends. And welcome back to one of my October specials, Monster Hunt. It's been a moment since we've gone out on the road together in search of some wonderfully wicked creatures, hasn't it? It feels really good to be doing Monster Hunt again. We've become accustomed to certain types of monsters online, a very special breed of horrors, freaks, killers, and beasts that live in creepypasta tales, sleeper hit paranormal videos, and viral images. And while they may exist in digital form, they share something certain with the monsters outside our devices. They are, to a greater degree than most realize, urban legends. Folklore runs deep within all traditions, and we have a beautiful tapestry of worldwide terrors to explore. But tonight, we'll be examining some urban legends that feel closer to being grouped in with their online counterparts than most, and taking a look at what startling facts may lie behind them. I'm sure you're also aware of our secondary objective tonight. This is Blood Drive, and we're not leaving until the town's painted red. To that end, we're focusing on some of the more lethal targets out in the wild that bring to mind the objects of internet folklore. Our first stop is Mattoon, Illinois, a small city caught in the middle of a sea of farmland squares. And while it may appear somewhat desolate now, I encourage you to imagine what it must have looked like in the mid-1940s when the first target on our list appeared. The horror began on August 31, 1944, at a home on Grant Avenue. Mr. Urban Rafe woke up early that morning to an odd smell that filled the house. He felt nauseous and immediately began vomiting. His wife, suspecting a home gas leak, tried to get up so she could check the stove to see if there was an issue, but found herself partially paralyzed. That night, another resident of Mattoon reported a similar incident. She had been woken up by the sound of her daughter coughing and realized she couldn't lift herself free of the bed. A newspaper report reveals the details of a third incident. A prowler who used some kind of anesthetic or gas to knock out his intended victims was on the loose in Mattoon Friday night. Mrs. Burt Kearney and her 3-year-old daughter, Dorothy Ellen, were victims of the anesthetic Friday night as they slept in bed at their home, 1408 Marshall Avenue. Both had recovered today, although Mrs. Kearney said that her mouth and throat remained parched, and her lips burned from effects of whatever was used by the prowler who was unsuccessful in getting into the house. Mrs. Kearney told the following story. It was shortly after 11 Friday night when I went to bed, taking with me my daughter, Dorothy. My sister, Mrs. Edgar Reedy, was in the living room of the home, and my daughter Carol, 2, and Mrs. Reedy's son, Roger, 3, were in another part of the house. I first noticed a sickening sweet odor in the bedroom, but at the time thought that it might be from the flowers outside the window. However, the odor grew stronger and I began to feel a paralysis of my legs and lower body. I grew frightened and screamed for Martha, Mrs. Reedy. She came into the bedroom, to which the door had been closed, and asked me what was the matter. I told her of the sensation I had, but I was unable then to move from bed. Mrs. Reedy at once noticed the odor, which seemed to come in an open window. She summoned a next-door neighbor, Mrs. Earl P. Robertson, 1412 Marshall Avenue, who called police. Mr. Robertson went to the Kearney home and searched the yard and the neighborhood, but could find no trace of the prowler. Police also searched without success. The prowler returned to the house about 12:30 and was seen at the bedroom window again by Mr. Kearney, a taxicab driver, as he came home after word had been sent to him concerning the earlier events. He gave chase, but the prowler escaped. The prowler was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and wore a tight-fitting cap, Mr. Kearney said. Police were called a second time, but another, more thorough search of the neighborhood was fruitless. Mrs. Kearney said that she recovered the use of her legs and arms completely within 30 minutes after the paralysis had set in. Her daughter, Dorothy, became ill from the odor, but had recovered this morning. Opinions differed as to the type of anesthetic used. However, because of its odor, it was believed to have been chloroform or ether, or a combination of both. The ingredients could have been sprayed into the room in a fine mist, and if used at a distance not too far from the sleepers, would have proved effective. Half a dozen more attacks were reported following the incident at the Kearney home, but none of the victims caught sight of their attacker or could provide clues. The first physical clue discovered was a white cloth, possibly a handkerchief, found on a porch next to a screen door. One of the inhabitants of the home, Beulah Cords, sniffed the cloth and became ill immediately, suffering similar effects as Mrs. Kearney, as well as sudden swelling in her face. When questioned, Mrs. Cords suggested the cloth may have been left on the porch to incapacitate their dog, who could have alerted them to an intruder. Nearby, a skeleton key was discovered, and a large tube of lipstick, almost empty. The most horrifying occurrence was reported that same night by Mrs. Leonard Burrell at North 13th Street. A stranger broke in through her bedroom window and then attempted to gas her directly. With so much activity and in such a short time, the local police decided to get the FBI involved, one of the earliest cases of the Bureau's attention being drawn to activity resembling the work of a serial killer. By the time the Mad Gasser of Mattoon had ceased operating, over 20 people had been involved in one of the attacks over the span of 2 horrifying weeks. The only evidence that mounted fit a pattern: footprints beneath windows, tears in window screens. Perhaps the most revelatory report came from the case of Bertha Birch, who saw the gasser and claimed it was a woman dressing as a man. So, what happened? Was the Mad Gasser of Mattoon ever caught or explained? Incredibly, no. The entire incident seemed to suddenly stop, leaving everyone without a suspect and forcing the town to come up with ideas of what actually happened. The local commissioner of public health had this to say: "There is no doubt that a gas maniac exists and has made a number of attacks, but many of the reported attacks are nothing more than hysteria. Fear of the gas man is entirely out of proportion to the menace of the relatively harmless gas he is spraying. The whole town is sick with hysteria." The local chief of police had an even less thoughtful idea about the events. There were no gas attacks whatsoever. The sickness came from chemicals produced at nearby industrial facilities being carried on the wind. A company nearby was considered as the culprit: Atlas Imperial, a manufacturer of diesel engines. However, they claimed to only have 5 gallons of carbon tetrachloride, the chemical suspected to be used in the attacks. The blame was then shifted to a case of toxic waste from the industrial area overall, either coming on the wind or making its way into town through some other unexplainable means. In examining these ideas, is it possible the investigators entirely missed how many workers at these plants would have had access to a variety of chemicals that could have been used in the attacks? The Mad Gasser of Mattoon was never identified, and decades later, neither was another specter whose appearance and behavior brought fears of chemical assailants to mind. Over the course of 10 years, people living near the woods in Mull, Switzerland experienced a strange form of haunting. Reports of a man in a camouflage coat and a gas mask wandering through the woods. While he wasn't doing anything harmful, his appearance was still quite frightening, and citizens kept reporting these sightings. In 2013, a picture was taken by someone walking through the woods, verifying the reports. News articles had been running around this time about the alleged ghost, who was dubbed Le Loyan, and after the picture was printed, a development occurred. On a walk through the woods, a resident of the area discovered the gas mask and camo coat, along with a letter, which was directed at one of the writers of the articles that sensationalized the apparent ghost. "Not only are you a moron, but you are above all an assassin. You murdered a very harmless being who found in his walks a real therapy of happiness, a cerebral resourcing allowing him to face the responsibilities and the vicissitudes of his normal life, and he had some. To hear you, we find ourselves in the Middle Ages, at the time of the witches. Why don't you rise up against the little toads, helmets, and hoods dressed in leather who backfire on their motorcycles in these same forests, them in violation? Do they take the time to meditate in front of the little oratory, to ask for a better world? I terrorize children? Make me laugh. Why are they not terrified by the horrors and the crimes, very real these, that they see on television in the media? Switzerland is small. Anything that is not in accordance with the garden gnome must be eradicated. I thought during these years while I was always left alone, until you, that these feelings were evolving. You give me the opposite proof, unfortunately. The phantom disappears. The risk of a beast hunt is too great. It will come back to haunt the narrow minds of your kind, for ultimately, a ghost never dies." One an assailant, the other a victim. The two specters couldn't be more different, but both still speak to our natural and morbid curiosity. From Switzerland, we now travel to Terrell, Texas, and to an even earlier time. In 1903, the small town of Terrell experienced a series of incidents that fall in line with every parent's nightmares. Children were going missing, and in ways that just didn't seem possible. Home one night, safe in their beds, then gone the next morning, with no evidence to explain the disappearance. One by one, the kids of Terrell disappeared, and a breakthrough only came once the people began interrogating those who remained. Someone had been leaving candy on their windowsills at night, and a few had even received friendly notes written on the wrappers from the Candy Lady. Around this time, a farmer reported a terrible discovery to police. Several small human teeth scattered in his field, all in various states of decay. The sheriff went to investigate, and he too disappeared, only to be found later in the same field, a pair of forks stabbed through his eyes and his pockets filled with candy. With their sheriff murdered, the people came together to figure out who could possibly be doing this, and finally, someone proposed the question, whatever happened to Clara Crane? In 1893, Leonard and Clara Crane lived together with their 5-year-old daughter Marcella on Leonard's farm. One day, Clara traveled into town for housekeeping business while Marcy was left alone with Leonard to watch her. But instead of paying attention to his daughter, he chose to pay attention to his bottles. Marcy wandered off to entertain herself and was killed while interacting with farm equipment. When Clara came home, she discovered her daughter's body and then came across Leonard, woken from a drunken stupor by his wife's cries of despair. 2 years of grieving followed, during which Clara became more and more withdrawn. She blamed her husband for Marcy's death, and eventually, that anger and sadness came to a boiling point. Clara Crane was known by her friends for her culinary skills, and one of her specialties was homemade caramels. One day, she decided to make a batch, which she hadn't done since her daughter was killed. Clara laced it with poison and presented it all to Leonard. One day after Leonard died, a neighbor checked on the Cranes and found Clara in a disturbed, erratic state, building a bonfire next to the home. The sheriff arrived, and when Clara acted aggressively towards him, she was arrested. It didn't take much effort to find Leonard's body right after, and Clara was put on trial for first-degree murder. The defense pled insanity, and she was committed to the North Texas Lunatic Asylum, now known as Terrell State Hospital. During the first year of her stay, doctors noted that Clara had torn up her bedsheets and used them to craft a large doll, which she called Marcy. Her condition deteriorated from there, with Clara playing house with her make-believe daughter. In 1899, overadmittance became an issue at the asylum. Because she was viewed as gentle by the staff, and her murder was a crime of passion, Clara was deemed safe enough to release, and no one kept track of her after that point. With no records of Clara's life or whereabouts after release, there was no way to verify the suspicion that quickly spread among the residents of Terrell. They knew who the Candy Lady was, and they could guess why she was so focused on taking their children. Parents across Terrell and the neighboring towns made it very clear to their kids that they should never take candy from strangers, or strange places. And if they ever found candy on their windowsills, they should be told right away. In time, caramel treats from the Candy Lady stopped appearing, and the 10 children of Terrell who went missing were never found. All we have left of Clara Crane is the message she wrote to her sister just before release. Dearest Aggie, I am elated. I have been informed by Dr. Matthews that Marcy and I will be returning home in less than 3 weeks. As you can imagine, Marcy can barely contain her excitement. Every night she asks, "Is tomorrow the day when we go home, Mother?" Very soon I will be able to tell her, yes. Our stay here has been somewhat of a trial, though I have been grateful to the good doctor and his staff in their dedication to our treatment and recovery. Leonard's death had put us in such a severe state of melancholy that I feared we would never escape it. These past few years have been more difficult than any in my life, and my dear Marcella, after all that she has had to endure, has become my strength, my flame of hope. Did Clara's flame of hope fade out following release? Or did she suddenly find one day that dear Marcy needed siblings, or a group of friends? We may never know what happened to the children who were led away from home by the Candy Lady, or her motives, but we do know what happened to their teeth. Now, let's travel north to the state of Nebraska and into a community territory called Portal in the city of La Vista. While it has been moved from the original location, you can still see the old Portal Schoolhouse in Papillion on North Jefferson Street. There are regular field trips here by school children, which makes the urban legend connected to it much more disturbing. In the early 1900s, there was a school teacher in Portal who was in charge of a particularly unruly class. Over time, she had become accustomed to dealing with difficult children, but this group had done more than any other in her teaching career to push the limits of her patience. Nobody knows what the inciting incident was. They just know what happened in its wake. One day, the school teacher finally had enough. She stopped talking mid-lesson, walked down the aisle to the back of the schoolhouse, and locked the door. Window by window, she closed the curtains until all view from the outside was obscured. Then she stepped behind her desk, reached down, and pulled out an axe. It isn't known what the children did, if they just stayed where they were, if they ran to the back of the room, if any tried to fight back or escape. The teacher swung the axe over and over and over, decapitating each and every student. She placed their heads on their desks, finally getting the front-facing attention she had demanded too many times. Then, when she had placed the final student's head on their assigned desk, the madness ceased. Realizing what she'd done, the teacher broke down and kneeled in the sea of blood on the floor of the schoolhouse. After her grieving spell, she picked up the axe and proceeded to retrieve the hearts from all of the bodies, collecting them in a basket. The teacher left the Portal Schoolhouse, basket in hand, and walked to a bridge stretching over Papillion Creek. She poured the children's hearts into the creek, as if trying to bring them back into the flow of life, or wash away her crime. As the legend goes, from that point on, anyone who stopped to listen to the creek while standing on the bridge would pick up on a new sound. A gentle, rhythmic thumping, granting it a new name, Heartbeat Bridge. For decades after, people would dare each other to stop and listen to the still beating hearts of the children. Now, there is no visible bridge over Papillion Creek near the original location of the schoolhouse, although there is a road where a bridge may have once been. As for the legend, if there had been a whole class murdered in the Portal Schoolhouse, it's rather difficult to imagine the building would have been preserved, let alone kept open for schools making field trips. And as for the teacher, some variants of the legend end with her jumping off the bridge and dying in the creek, adding a sorrowful ghost to the story who now haunts the bridge. Other variants just end with her dumping the children's hearts into the water. But there are no records of a crime of this nature, of course, and no mention of the teacher's name. The legend may have started only due to children being forced into boring field trips to the old Portal Schoolhouse, who maybe wanted to spice things up through imagination. You could almost picture it. An early October trip, riding on the bus as it creaks and bumps along the roads, and a child in the seat in front of you stands on his knees and turns around to ask, "Want to know the real story behind this place?" From bored students in Nebraska now, we turn to a similar scenario in a different location, restless campers in Rhode Island. Camp Carana in Cumberland has been around since 1937, but we can't be sure how long the story of Hotshot Charlie has been shared. What we do know, from campers who have shared the tale online, is this. Decades ago, a man named Charles Torrey lived in the area of Camp Carana with his wife and daughter on a homestead in a small cabin. It was a peaceful existence, except for the vandalism they would experience at the hands of former campers in the off-season, who knew the grounds weren't being watched by any security. What started as some pranks eventually grew to more serious things, like letting the animals out of their pens. Torrey got a shotgun, filled it with rock salt, and when the vandals returned, he used it. Furious and burnt from the salt rounds, 3 of the kids came back that night and set the cabin on fire while Torrey was putting the animals away in the barn. By the time he smelled the smoke, it was too late. The cabin was fully ablaze, and he ran inside to save his wife and daughter, but couldn't get into the room where they were trapped. Severely burned, he fled the collapsing cabin and disappeared into the woods. The following summer, when the campers all returned, the vandals were among them. And one by one, Hotshot Charlie murdered all 3, finally taking revenge for the death of his wife and daughter. Now, 2 things. First, if you were with me on Monster Hunt 2 back in 2017, you might find this is a very familiar story, because it has details that are almost identical to the legend of Cropsey, and it may be a case of shared folklore, or the natural course of urban legends combining or morphing. Second, there is another variant of this tale, with an additional detail. In some versions of the story, it's described how the vengeful Mr. Torrey performed his murders, thanks to an unexpected ending. In the wake of the vandals' murders, a search was conducted of the woods, and Torrey was spotted sneaking into the remains of his home, which had a trap door for basement access. Upon lifting the door and dragging Torrey into the light, they discovered the murder weapon. His own fingernails, grown out to a horrific degree and sharpened for stabbing and slashing. He was tried and hanged right there on the remains of his home, but it's said his ghost still haunts the woods, trapped in his vengeance and still seeking campers to slaughter. And this version of the story often comes with one detail changed. In the first version, he's Hotshot Charlie. In the second, his name reflects his state at the end of the legend, Freddy Fingernails. Does that ring a bell? A horribly burned man named Freddy slaughters kids using terribly grown-out and sharpened fingernails. That's right. The complete version of this story, like the full legend of Cropsey, gives us the foundation of one of cinema's most iconic slashers. Freddy Fingernails might have been the true unspoken inspiration for Freddy Krueger from A Nightmare on Elm Street. Campers would tell each other, "Don't go out in the woods at night because he'll kill you with his fingernails," whether the name of the killer was Charlie or Freddy in their version of events. Some of the legend variants also claim it didn't take place on the grounds of Camp Carana. Instead, it happened right near a graveyard called Bellew Cemetery, which certainly increases the fear factor. These two places are apparently 12 minutes apart, which does make you wonder how the location confusion occurred. But at the same time, they are only 12 minutes apart, and both are classic urban legend settings. Now, it has long been established how Wes Craven, the creator of A Nightmare on Elm Street, came up with the idea for Freddy Krueger. In a 2014 interview, he said this: "I'd read an article in the LA Times about a family who had escaped the killing fields in Cambodia and managed to get to the US. Things were fine, and then suddenly the young son was having very disturbing nightmares. He told his parents he was afraid that if he slept, the thing chasing him would get him, so he tried to stay awake for days at a time. When he finally fell asleep, his parents thought this crisis was over. Then they heard screams in the middle of the night. By the time they got to him, he was dead. He died in the middle of a nightmare." That's always what comes up if you search what Craven has said about where Freddy comes from. That, plus a creepy drunk who smiled through his window when he was a child. And while it explains the nightmare murder aspect of Freddy Krueger, the burned body and long fingernail knife gloves don't often come into the conversation. As far as those go, the Wikipedia article mentions the following. Freddy Krueger's name comes from one of Craven's childhood bullies named Fred Krueger. The burned body comes from needing a killer characteristic like a mask, but wasn't a mask because Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees already had that. And the killings needed something other than a knife, because that was too common, so he thought, how about a glove with steak knives? Like we've seen with Cropsey's story influencing Friday the 13th before the franchise existed, it's very possible that the story of Freddy Fingernails somehow made its way into the creative subconscious of Wes Craven and resulted in aspects of the iconic killer. It's also possible that this is a case of post-movie attribution, with those who tell the tale swearing their story came first. Until documentation can be produced regarding Freddy Fingernails with dates that line up, like we've seen in the Cropsey case, it's not quite possible to tell who came first. What we do know is this: the tradition of sharing a good horror legend around the campfire is alive and well in Cumberland, Rhode Island. And now to make one more trip, bringing a new country to our Monster Hunt ledger. This story is quite the mix of elements: reality, fable, online, offline. But we'll begin with the aspect most appropriate for our blood drive experience: the creepypasta it spawned. The Alice killings remain, to this day, one of the strangest and unsolvable serial killings in Japan. From 1999 to 2005, a series of 5 killings took place. The 5 killings might have been completely different if not for the calling card that the killer left at each crime scene in an obvious location that had Alice written on it in the victim's blood. Very few clues were found at each crime scene, and eventually, the case went cold. The first victim was Sasaki Megumi, a 29-year-old owner of a restaurant. She was known by her customers for her fine cooking and her dedication to her job. Outside of her job, Megumi was very social and often went to parties. It was after one such party that she went missing. She decided to walk home from her friend's house, seeing as she was only a block from home and she was a bit too drunk to drive. Several people offered to drive her, but she shrugged it off. She was seen leaving the party at 1 in the morning, and this is the last time she was seen alive. The next morning, a couple walking in the woods about a mile from Megumi's house saw a large amount of blood on an overgrown, unused path. Curious, they followed it, where they found Megumi's body. She had been torn to pieces, her parts impaled on various tree branches. It was the police that found the playing card granted to Megumi's mouth, the Jack of Spades, which had the word Alice written on it. Yamane Akio was a barely known singer in a band that never played anything more than at various bars and community functions. His friends described him as a kind-hearted man who would never raise his voice off stage. Akio was abducted from his apartment on February 11, 2001. His bandmates were the last people to see him alive, as he had practiced with them earlier in the day. That night, his girlfriend came to visit him and was surprised to find the house empty. On the security footage of the apartment, a hooded figure could be seen entering through a side door and leaving with a large garbage bag that bulged strangely. This strange appearance was never accounted for, and no one saw the strange man in person. The following week, the owner of the bar Yoshida's, where the band had often performed, was opening for the day and was met with a grisly sight. Slumped at a table was Akio's body. His vocal cords had been ripped from his throat, and he had been shot in the head. His Alice card was a king of diamonds and was found clutched in his hands along with his ruined vocal cords. A teen girl, Kai Sakura had her whole life ahead of her. She was a sweet girl and well loved by her classmates and relatives. She wanted to go to college to be a fashion designer and was a week from graduating high school when she was abducted. Her body was buried in a shallow grave. It didn't seem that the killer wanted her hidden. On the contrary, he had marked her grave with her Alice playing card, the Queen of Clubs. It had been taped to a stick and stuck on top of the grave. Sakura's body had been horribly mutilated. Her eyes had been carved from her body, her skin was flayed, and her mouth had been carved open. A crown had been sewn to her head, likely while she was still alive. Along with Sakura's body was a note, written in straggly handwriting. It contained many disjointed phrases, some of which were unreadable. Death is a distorted dream. She will forever rule. And those which die are the lucky ones. Hina and Hayato Oshiro were the last of the killings, and the least gruesome. Hayato and Hina were siblings and very close. Hina was the older sister and was very stubborn. Her younger brother, Hayato, was very smart and had skipped a grade, causing him to be in the same class as his beloved sister. The two were found dead in their beds on April 4, 2005. The cause of death was lethal injection. The children's bedroom window was open, and it was deduced that the killer snuck in quietly enough to kill the two without waking them, then snuck back out. Each child held half of an Ace of Hearts playing card that, when put together, spelled out the word Alice. On April 30th, 2008, a producer known as Yugami P uploaded his first song to Nico video, called Hitapashira Arisu, translated roughly as Alice of Human Sacrifice. This song is believed to be based off of the Alice killings. It tells the story of a little dream who lures people into its world, and then goes on to tell the story of each Alice. The song has a few parallels with each killing. The first Alice, depicted as Miyako, was trapped in the woods, which is where Mikumi's body was found. The second Alice, depicted as Kaito, was a singer who was shot by a madman. The third Alice, depicted as Hatsune Miku, was well loved, became the country's queen, and was taken over by a distorted dream. The fourth Alice, depicted as Kagamine Ren/Len, was a pair of twins regarded as one Alice. They are described as a stubborn big sister and intelligent younger brother. It also speaks of how they have yet to awaken, a possible reference to them dying in their sleep. In addition, the suits of the cards found with each body are also mentioned. Yugami P has not stated for sure if the song has any relation to the Alice killings, but it is widely assumed. Is there really a song based on these killings? Yugami P is real, and so is the song Alice of Human Sacrifice. It was uploaded to the Japanese site Nico Video, and there's a mirror on YouTube for those who want to watch the video and listen to the song. It's a Vocaloid track and comes from the album Vocalo Anthems by Exit Tunes. According to the Vocaloid wiki, the story of the song goes as follows. A brief introduction at the beginning tells of a tiny dream, which in order to survive, traps people inside itself, allowing them to create their own world in order to keep them dreaming and sustaining its own existence. Since it will cease to exist unless someone dreams it, it traps the new sleeper once the old one has died in the dream. The first part is the story of Miyako, the first Alice. She is the brave one who kills everyone and anything she sees so that she can make her way. She is forever trapped as a sinner, with only her paths of blood showing she ever existed. The second is the story of Kaito, the second Alice. He is tame and obedient and sings to create a world, but his twisted words create a world of madness. He is shot by a madman, and as he bleeds out and dies, he is looked upon with adoration. The third section is the story of Miku, who deludes many people as the third Alice. She builds a kingdom and names herself the queen. However, she becomes afraid of death and the prospect of her body aging and rotting away. She rules at the top of her kingdom alone. The last section tells of Ren and Len, presented as being one Alice who are full of wonder, receiving an invitation from a castle. They were the closest to Alice, but they are still in the dream and continue to wander around the Wonderland, never to awaken. There are many interpretations of this section, as in one ending they get killed by Miko, but no matter what, the twins never leave Wonderland. The song ending is left open, leaving viewers wondering who will be the next victim of the twisted dream. Yugami P's only clue to the meaning of the song is the history of the Vocaloids themselves. From cursory glances alone on the Vocaloid wiki, it's clear the producer is referring to the character history of the singers in question, and this really may just be a case of taking something innocent or positive in popular media and giving it a dark twist. That being said, was there ever really an Alice killer? What came first, the urban legend or the song? From all appearances, it seems the order goes as follows: the Vocaloid song, the creepypasta, and then the legend, because it's all too easy to take the creepypasta, strip away its context and author, and share it online as an urban legend, which is, by nature, how a lot of creepypasta tales actually gain popularity and impact. First you hear the story, then you find the fiction as the source. And yet, there was a true playing card killer. He came from Madrid, Spain, and his name was Alfredo Galán. In 2003, Galán used a pistol to murder 6 people and wound 3, leaving Spanish playing cards at the scene of his murders to act as a signature and get the media talking. He was certainly the attention-seeking sort of serial killer, ultimately confessing directly to the police and claiming it was because they were too stupid to catch him. It is interesting, isn't it, how some stories come to be? Alice of Human Sacrifice was a song, which, in its mystery and dark subject matter, inspired a creepypasta to explain the background of the lyrics, and then that tale became its own thing, running around online and in Japan as an urban legend, unattached to the song and the bit of amateur fiction. Now, the Alice killer isn't real, but there are those who have witnessed similar scenes in Spain as those described in the story, and for them, a lone playing card now gives off a very different impression than a call to Wonderland. Thanks to all of you for viewing, and thanks to all the supporters on Patreon who make October on Nightmind possible and empower the Nightmind Index for new and undiscovered nonfiction projects. If you'd like to support the channel and the continuous effort of broadcasting new creators and artwork, please consider joining the Nightmind Patreon. You can do so for as low as just $2 a month and join all the creatures of the night whose names you'll see at the end of this video. And for all of you who are only just discovering Monster Hunt and are craving more, I have good news. You'll find these and the playlist for our other October tradition, SCP Vault, in the video description below. Feel free to enjoy these episodes and previous October specials, as well as a full collection playlist. That's all for tonight's exploration of the Blood Drive. Once more, I'm Nick Nocturne, and I'll be seeing you again real soon. Until our next October evening together, stay safe out there, be sure to listen if someone has an interesting story to share, and sleep tight.